Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our ongoing series, The Perils Facing the African Continent. In the last episode, we explored how the initial promise of independence for states in Africa during the 1950s and 60s was overshadowed by the continent becoming a battleground for the Cold War era. Today, we turn our attention to yet another pivotal moment for the continent, Africa in the post-Cold War era, its profound impact and the complex dynamics that emerged in its wake. I intend to cover this period in two parts. Part 1 will be presented today, while Part 2 will be covered in our next episode. The onset of the post-Cold War era is marked by the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which triggered significant shifts across the world, impacting at all levels of the international system. The post-Cold War era period was initially perceived as the moment of great power cooperation. There was excitement as both presidents of the time, Mikhail Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush, defined the period as a new world order. For others, the post-Cold War era marked a period of a unipolar world where the United States of America was perceived as the only remaining superpower. In their view, the collapse of communism and the decline of other authoritarian regimes had left liberal democracy as the only remaining viable political framework. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama, in his famous book, The End of History and the Last Man, published in 1992, argues that Western liberal democracy has become the final form of human government and that free market capitalism had triumphed. Fukuyama's idea of the end of history signified the final stage of ideological evolution as earlier envisaged by 18th and 19th century German philosophers Friedrich Hegel and Karl Marx. However, other scholars, such as Samuel Huntington, cautioned against Fukuyama's optimism, predicting instead a clash of civilization where cultural and religious identities will dominate global politics. For Africa, this tension between optimism and caution proved especially relevant as the turn of events presented mostly formidable challenges rather than opportunities. States in Africa were forced to navigate yet another unfamiliar, uncertain, mostly dangerous period while still reeling from the rigors of previous tragic events. Immediately at the onset of the post-Cold War era, the states in Africa were faced with complex set of realities. First, Western powers, led by the United States of America, gave new conditionalities to states in Africa that were not considered during the Cold War era. These new conditions included democratization, economic reforms, and human rights, among many others. As a result, in the 1990s, violence was witnessed across many countries in Africa that were clamoring for multi-party democracy as opposed to one-party authoritarian rule. To cite a few examples, in Zambia, Malawi, Benin, long-serving rulers were voted out. Kenya became a de jure multi-party state in 1992, and South Africa ended apartheid in 1994. Donor aid was tied to governance reforms, democratic practices were incentivized, Africa was again being marginalized and sidelined in global affairs. Second, there was a surge in citizen rebellion against dictators across the continent. An example is late Mobutu Sese Seko of Congo, which saw the collapse of his regime in May 1997, and other authoritarian leaders who served as puppets to either of the superpowers and were untouchable during the Cold War era. At the same time, human rights organizations flourished, abuses documented, and citizens were mobilized demanding for reforms. As a result, fragility and instability spread across the continent. And though there was impression of democracy flourishing in the African continent, peace and security remained elusive. Third, Africa faced numerous internal and intercommunal conflicts, which had been masked during the Cold War era. As a result, there was flare-up across the continent with numerous intrastate wars. Conflicts raged across many countries in Africa. Somalia collapsed in 1991, plunging into a protracted civil war that saw warlords, clans, and later violent extremist groups competing for power. There was genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994, where the country witnessed nearly 1 million people killed in 100 days. Unfortunately, the international community, including the United Nations, abandoned both Rwanda and Somalia at their time of need. In Liberia, 2 successive civil wars were fought, 1989 to 1997, and 1999 through to 2003, that brought mass displacement, atrocities, and the use of child soldiers before peace was restored with international intervention. In Sierra Leone, the civil war was equally devastating, driven by struggles over power and resources, especially diamonds. Both conflicts, fueled by the exploitation of mineral resources, left deep scars on society in both countries. In the same period, the Democratic Republic of Congo experienced the First and Second Congo Wars between 1990 and 2003 at different stages through the period. This was fueled by competition over minerals, ethnic tensions, and political instability that left about 5.4 million people dead. Despite peace agreements, cycles of violence have continued in Eastern Congo, making it one of the deadliest and most complex conflicts in modern African history. The Democratic Republic of Congo even today remains the epicenter of the Great Lakes conflict system. These legacies of instability continue to echo in Africa even today, with newer security threats such as violent extremism in the Sahel, terrorist groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, and Al-Shabaab in Somalia, demonstrating the unfinished nature of the continent's search for peace. Fourth, the effects of the harsh conditions of the structural adjustment programs, SAPs, that were imposed by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank in the 1980s, reached its peak in the early 1990s. You do recall from our previous episode, governments cut public spending, privatized state enterprises, and liberalized economies. The result was devastating for ordinary citizens, schools and hospitals lost funding, millions lost jobs, and poverty deepened. In response, many citizens turned to informal economies and alternative coping mechanisms. Many associated democracies not with prosperity, but with economic hardship. These reforms created widespread resentment and left fragile governments vulnerable to unrest. The combination of the above factors left states in Africa weaker, fragile, and at the mercy of external actors prying the continent for a variety of their national or private interests. The African continent, in the face of those complex challenges, attempted to make positive steps and remain resilient in pushing for independence, sovereignty, and continental unity. An example of such significant leap include the Abuja Treaty of 1991, officially recognized as the treaty establishing the African Economic Community, AEC, to create a continent-wide economic bloc by following a six-stage process of regional and then continental integration. The treaty, which came into force in 1994, aimed to achieve a free trade area, a customs union, a common market, and eventually a monetary union and single currency in Africa. Regional economic communities, which are to be used for integrating the continent, such as ECOWAS, IGAD, CENSAD for the Sahel region, SADC in the south, ECAS in Central Africa, AMU or Arab Maghreb Union in the north, and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, became vibrant, while those that had collapsed, like the EAC, were revived. However, the journey of uniting Africa has not been easy. There are challenges such as the lack of political will and commitment, poor governance, and overlapping membership, which slowed the progress of integration. For Africa, uniting the continent using the regional economic communities is the most viable path for states in Africa to achieve self-reliance and some degree of sovereignty. The turn of the millennium came with several promises. In the year 2000, world leaders gathered at the United Nations to shape a broad vision to fight poverty in its many dimensions. As a result, the United Nations envisaged the Millennium Development Goals that had 8 goals and 21 targets to be achieved between 2000 and 2015. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, transformed about the same time into the African Union, a process that began with the Sirte Declaration, Libya, in 1999, and concluded with the African Union's official launch in Durban, South Africa in 2002. There was hope for increased cooperation and integration, focusing on economic development, social progress, and a unified continent. Leaders like Muammar Gaddafi of Libya promoted Pan-Africanism, with Gaddafi playing a central role in financing and shaping the African Union. Importantly, the African Union also created the Peace and Security Council in 2004 as a standing decision-making body, conflict prevention, management, and resolution. Missions such as African Union Mission in Somalia, AMISOM, highlighted Africa's first real attempts at collective security. New institutions such as the African Peace and Security Architecture, and the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, later transitioned to become AUDA, or AU Development Agency, were established. There was hope for an African Renaissance whose proponent, Thabo Mbeki, envisioned will uplift Africa from its present state of widespread poverty, violent conflicts, human rights violations, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and the lack of good governance. Economically, Africa experienced the Africa Rising narrative in the mid-2000s. High commodity prices, foreign investment, and debt relief fueled rapid growth. Countries like Ethiopia, Ghana, and Mozambique posted impressive growth rates. Cities expanded and middle classes emerged. This period raised hopes that Africa was finally breaking from cycles of stagnation, drawing major interest from global investors, and reshaping perceptions of the continent as a promising economic frontier. Yet this growth was fragile, heavily dependent on resource exports such as oil, minerals, and agricultural products, leaving economies vulnerable to global market swings. When commodity prices dropped in the late 2000s, many countries slid back into debt crisis, exposing deeper structural weaknesses like our over-reliance on the exports of raw materials, lack of industrial diversification, and limited social safety nets. The benefits of growth were unevenly distributed, with poverty and inequality persisting despite impressive headline figures. To conclude this part, it is evident that the first 2 decades of the post-Cold War era was truly turbulent, a period of complexities and uncertainties for states in Africa. In our next episode, that's part 2, we'll explore Africa from the 2000s and beyond, examining the rise of terrorism, the global war on terror, the fall of Gaddafi, climate change dynamics, emergence of multipolarity, and Africa's pursuit of long-term transformation under Agenda 2063 and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Thank you for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, and share this podcast to keep the conversation going. Africa's future depends on how deeply we understand its past. See you in the next part of this episode. Thank you.